Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. The Scuffle at Stepstone Ford. Arpnick was a goblin in a hurry. In his pack he had a quantity of earth containing secondary mycelium of the scarlet spangenhelm mushroom. He had excavated this with the intention of starting his own mushroom farm, in order to manufacture sorcerer's tea, a drink that, when consumed by goblins, induced intense psychedelic experiences. He was confident that this would make him very rich. He was in a hurry because he had stolen the secret of the scarlet spangenhelm mushroom and the clods of fungus-infested earth in his pack from the elves. He was therefore rushing to get away from the elven forest and back to the Goblin Downs as quickly as possible. His anxiety was compounded by the fact that, in order to commit the theft, he had considered it necessary to murder an elf named Nimerath, and he was concerned that this would infuriate the elves even more than the theft. He was correct in this supposition. Arpnick had 4 companions. There was Klimko, who carried an axe and shield. There was Draka, with his 2-handed spear. There was Ferid the archer, and Taran, who was armed with a crossbow. Arpnick himself wore a mail vest, and bore a shield and a spiked mace. There were 4 elves on his trail, seeking revenge for Nimerath. Their leader was Golandor, with his 2-handed sword. Then there was Loradal, carrying a shield and with an arming sword at his hip. There were 2 elves armed with longbows, Doradil and Penarillin. All of the elves wore mail shirts, with the exception of Penarillin, who was unarmoured. The elves knew the forest well. To return to the Goblin Downs, Arpnick would have to cross the swift-running waters of the River Rockrush. The only crossing was at Stepstone Ford. The elves made all haste to that point, in the hope that they could cut Arpnick off at the crossing and mete out some justice. The goblins' path back to the Goblin Downs ran through forested hills, from which they were now descending. At the foot of the slope the river glinted silver in the sunlight. They would soon be across the ford and away home, and there was still no sign of pursuit. This was because the elves had not followed the main path. They had taken a shortcut, and even now were advancing along the riverbank, concealed from the goblins by the intervening trees. But the elves soon alerted the goblins to their presence. Klimko, who was leading the group, stopped abruptly in his tracks as an elven arrow fizzed past his face and implanted itself in a tree behind him. The goblins clustered on the hillside, disconcerted, trying to locate the archer who had shot at them. It was Draka who first spotted the elves below and to the goblins' right, rushing along the riverbank toward the ford. Golandor was leading the way, closely followed by Loradal, while the archers lagged behind, looking up the hill for targets glimpsed through the trees. The race was on. Draka dashed headlong down the hillside, with his companions straggling behind him. Draka reached the ford before the elves did. He hesitated at the water's edge. Should he press on across the river, leaving his companions to fend for themselves, or try to hold the crossing until the rest of his party arrived? Crossing the river now might save his skin, but the promise of future riches was in Arpnick's pack. Golandor was closing fast. Draka turned away from the ford and charged toward him, lunging at the elf with his spear. Golandor sidestepped, swinging his 2-handed sword, and it was Draka's turn to dodge. And now Loradal joined the fight. Draka turned to meet this new foe, stabbing at Loradal's face, trying to keep him at a distance. He succeeded better than he had hoped. Loradal crumpled lifeless to the earth as the spear point hit home. But Draka did not have time to exult in this victory. Galandor was still swinging his sword with deadly intent. Draka staggered backward, barely avoiding a blow that would have detached him from his head, and, regretting his previous bravery, turned and ran back toward the ford, with Galandor in pursuit. Doradil and Penrillin had moved up the hill into the woods, each taking position behind a convenient tree, from where they could cover the final stretch of path leading down to the ford. As for the goblins, Taran was also looking to do some shooting. He advanced cautiously toward the elves, crossbow spanned and ready at his shoulder, looking for a target. And he soon found one. Galandor pitched forward, a crossbow bolt embedded deep in his chest. Draka was now safe from Galandor, but not from Doradil. The elf loosed an arrow, and that was the end of Draka. And now all 4 remaining goblins gathered by the ford. Taran and Ferid faced the trees, exchanging arrows with Doradil and Penrillin, while Arpnik and Klimko made their way across the river. Arrows splashed into the water and skipped off the stepping stones, but none hit the goblins. As Arpnik and Klimko scrambled up the far bank, Taran and Ferid edged backward to the ford, and then both loosed a final shot, turned and fled, leaping from rock to rock across the stream. The frustrated elven archers loosed the last few arrows in their quivers across the river at the rapidly retreating goblins, but to no avail. The goblins had slipped through the net. Thus it was that Arpnik escaped the vengeance of the elves, and brought the scarlet Spangenhelm to the Goblin Downs. Thus ended the scuffle at Stepstone Ford, and thus began the war between the elves and the goblins.